In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees for a split second the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months. You only have about 13 minutes from the warning to the arrival of a tornado. Keep that in mind as you watch this. In 2017, a woman living in Oklahoma heard the eerie tornado siren going off outside her car, and she started filming. Instead of stopping at a nearby shelter, she decides to gun it home because she's only 10 minutes away. But by the time she was about to turn onto her street, the sky had turned totally black, and she started to panic that she wasn't going to get home in time. She finally makes it to her parking garage that's now totally pitch black, and she starts running for her door, and as she's running, she's filming. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close. They had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents had gone through a really messy divorce, and during it, their father had just walked out on them and they never saw him again. And shortly after that, their mother remarried and her new husband moved in with the family, and shortly after that, their mother just vanished. She went out on an errand and she never came back. And the boys, they were very suspicious of their stepfather because this did not feel like something their mom would do. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. And so all of a sudden, these teenage boys are just left to fend for themselves. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City for their mother, and they just could never get any sort of closure. And so today, the two brothers had met up not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. And at some point, they decide, okay, you know what? Not only are we going to clean this place out, but also there's some basic renovations that really need to happen here. And so over the next couple of days, they would call in some contractors to begin to do some basic renovations in the house while the brothers continued to clean it up. And on one particular day, when a group of contractors were working in the master bedroom, the brothers were in the living room doing their own thing when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. As the two brothers, they got up, they bolt into the master suite, and they look at something that was just sitting on the ground. And at first, they didn't even know what they were looking at. But then the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was. Suddenly, the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It would turn out the brothers were right. Their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day their mother left and never came back again, somehow or another, she was bound and gagged and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. And we know this because when that contractor 2 decades later was doing renovations for the brothers inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite, and when he pulled it out again, a white object came tumbling out of the wall. And that object was their mother's skull. And after pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they would find the rest of her skeleton clearly bound and gagged. And then perhaps most disturbingly of all is that in the wall, they would also find all these scratch marks, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, which means she was in there desperately trying to get the attention of her sons to save her, but nobody could hear her. Police would come to the house, they would look all over the place and try to figure out what happened to their mother, who killed her, but they couldn't solve it. Now, the police always did suspect that the stepfather very likely had some level of involvement here, just given the fact that he himself went missing a couple of days after the mother did. But they could never locate him, and very likely they never will, because today he'd be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead. 46-year-old Paul Baxter started feeling sick, and then he developed a wicked cough that got so bad over a couple of days that he could barely speak because he was just coughing the entire time. And so he went to his doctor, who quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia and put him on a treatment plan. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. There, they did an x-ray of his chest and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker, but before they just put him under the knife and started cutting this out of his lung, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it and run it down into his lungs and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw this lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. And so he told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to try to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move around the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, and so he pulled the probe out, and he told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days when he could use a longer and more powerful probe. And so Paul looks at the doctor and he's like, "What is this orange thing inside of my lungs?" The doctor said, "Honestly, I have no idea, but it's not supposed to be in there." A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure, and the doctor, using this longer, more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lungs. And as soon as he pulled it free, there was a camera screen that was watching in real time what this probe was seeing. And so Paul and the doctor and the other doctors that were in there as well all got to see for the first time what this thing was. And it was this kind of triangular small orange thing that nobody had seen before. And so as it was getting pulled up and out of Paul's body, everyone's just watching the camera wondering what this thing is. And then finally the pinchers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. It was a small plastic orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. And as soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him, and he told the doctors when he was 7 years old, he swallowed, or so he thought, a cone that looked an awful lot like this one. He hadn't swallowed it, he had inhaled it. And then somehow, for 40 plus years, he'd had no symptoms related to it until now when he developed that cough. Paul would say when he had this revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing because none of the doctors had seen anything like it before and didn't really know how to react to it. And so Paul was allowed to keep his traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. On the morning of September 23rd, 1839, an experienced sailor named Captain Brighton was traveling through the Drake Passage, which is located right along the northern coast of Antarctica. This was a freezing cold, very austere part of the world, kind of a dangerous place to be. The Drake Passage had proven to be as dangerous as expected. Just the previous night, the ocean around the ship had literally frozen, anchoring the ship in place. And so when this happened, it was unclear if they could actually survive that. But fortunately, also the previous night, this massive storm rolled in, which that's dangerous in and of itself. But the severity of the storm was actually a good thing because it broke up the ice around the ship and allowed Captain Brighton to sail away. And so he needed to decide if he was going to keep on sailing further into the Drake Passage or leave now before it was too late. But as Captain Brighton weighed his options, he suddenly noticed something over the horizon. It was another ship, which was really surprising because again, nobody really comes out here. But as he continued to stare at the ship, he realized it was actually a schooner, which is a ship designed for traveling. But as Captain Brighton stared at the schooner that was getting closer and closer, he saw it was in pretty rough shape. Captain Brighton knew they actually did have quite a bit of supplies, and so he called out to his men to ready a dinghy and get some supplies because they were gonna go over to this schooner and basically offer up some extra supplies and also check in on them and make sure they were okay. Captain Brighton, along with 4 other men, hopped in the dinghy and they began paddling over to the schooner. And as they got closer, they'd be able to look into the portholes, which are like windows on the side of the schooner, and Captain Brighton could clearly see there were people inside of the schooner. He called out a few times, but it was windy and sort of loud, and so eventually Captain Brighton and his crew just climbed up the ladder and boarded the ship. And once they were on the deck of the schooner, and so Captain Brighton and his men walked into the captain's quarters, and he calls out to this man who clearly appears to be the captain, but the man doesn't say or do anything. He's clearly focused on something at his desk. Captain Brighton began walking across the room, and then finally he was right behind the man, and he actually looked down and read what the man had been writing. This is what it said. "Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains." However, as unsettling as that would be to read for anybody in this situation, what was the most unsettling part was actually what was written right above that journal entry. The date, January 17th, 1823. 16 years before. That captain and his entire crew were all dead, and had been for 16 years. They got trapped in the ice just like Captain Brighton had, but it didn't break up. They were stranded, and they all froze to death. And because it was so cold out in that part of the world, all their bodies were preserved in their final moments. It was like all these people had been frozen in time for nearly 2 decades, just floating around in Drake's Passage. And basically nobody had found them until Captain Brighton. On the night of May 29, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. The bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table. Robalito wanted to introduce himself. Just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. He was taking a bit of a risk because when he identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. When the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed the mood in the bar completely shifted to almost silent. At some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note, and when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked. It was around this point that he looked back at Robalito, the bouncer, and all he would have seen is Robalito angrily belting out the words, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, Robalito, while singing this song, pulls out a aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, 12 people have been murdered. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. In 2013, Jim Stauffer's mother finally passed away from Alzheimer's disease at the age of 74. Her doctors told Jim that her disease had mutated in a way they had not seen before, and they asked if he'd be willing to donate her body so they could study her brain. Jim felt like his mother would want him to say yes, and so he agreed. But for a variety of administrative reasons, the neurologists couldn't actually accept Jim's mother's body. So while he couldn't donate her body to these neurologists, he could donate her body to the Biological Resource Center in Phoenix, Arizona. A year later, that Biological Resource Center was raided by the FBI after accusations they were selling these donated bodies for profit. One of the bodies that was sold was Jim's mother. She had been strapped to the chair and then had a bomb detonated underneath her. During this FBI investigation, there was a man's body on the wall with a female head sewed onto it. Jim, along with 19 other families, sued the center, and finally, in 2019, they were awarded $58 million in damages. 7-year-old Bruce Farron, along with his aunt, uncle, and cousins, began the 2-mile hike into the Uinta mountain range in Utah. They were headed for Pyramid Lake, where they planned to do some camping for a couple of days. After they arrived, they decided they would head down to the water to cool off. But right before they got in the water, Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom. And so his family got into the water, and Bruce walked over to a grove of trees and bushes to relieve himself. After a couple of minutes, Bruce did not come out of the wood line, and so his aunt and uncle started yelling for him. He didn't come out again, and so the uncle walked up and walked into the trees to go find his nephew, but he was not there. And so his uncle starts yelling for his nephew, but he's nowhere to be found. And so he yelled back for his wife and his kids to come help him look. And for the next hour, they searched the entire area yelling for Bruce, but there was no sign of him. So they contacted the authorities. That day, a huge search was launched for Bruce, but just like his family, nobody could find any trace of him. The following day at 4 p.m., Bruce had still not been located. And at this point, his family is starting to lose hope. And it was around that time that a searcher who was several miles away from where Bruce had last been seen was walking up this very steep trail heading up towards this cliff. And the searcher knew this cliff was 500 feet and there was no way a child could climb up it or down it. And so he was about to turn around and go search somewhere else when he happened to look up and he saw a child walking down the trail towards him, and the child was Bruce. And Bruce was totally fine, albeit a little bit hungry. A According to David Paulides, all of these search and rescue models that predict where missing people will end up after they go missing say that boys aged 7 to 9 will be found within a 7.2 mile radius 95% of the time, and that distance could be covered over a week's time. In order for Bruce to be found where he was, he would have needed to cover 20 miles along a rugged ridgeline before scaling down that 500-foot cliff without the aid of climbing gear, and he did all that within 30 hours, a seemingly impossible task for a missing 7-year-old boy. When asked what happened, Bruce said he didn't remember. He didn't understand why or how he had gotten lost in the first place. The only things he remembered were sleeping between 2 downed logs and drinking from a waterfall and many animals, including one that was so close to him at night that it would jump over him. Bruce was followed up with as he got older, but he never could regain the memory of what actually happened to him. Some have speculated that Bruce might have been abducted when he went to the bathroom, and that's the only way he was able to cover that great of a distance in that amount of time, that his abductor basically physically moved him at least part of the way, and that perhaps his abductor was one of these animals he saw at night. In December of 2014, a 24-year-old man named Aaron Frazier sat in the driver's seat of an excavator in the backyard of his childhood home in Jacksonville, Florida. Aaron was ripping out the backyard swimming pool of his old home, a home which his father had recently given him the deed to. But this property was not a nostalgic place for Aaron. In fact, he hadn't lived here since he was 3 years old, and the handful of memories he had from being in this place were basically all bad. His parents fought all the time, and then one day in 1993, his mom just decided to leave, and before long, Aaron was shipped off to foster care. So now he was kind of enjoying demolishing the property. By early afternoon, the pool was all gone. And so Aaron swung his bucket over to the outdoor shower that was located next to where the pool had been, and he dug the bucket into the concrete, and as soon as he did, immediately this geyser of water shot into the sky. And so Aaron knew he must have hit a water line. And so Aaron jumped out of the excavator, he turned off the water, and then he grabbed a shovel and headed over to the outdoor shower to inspect the damage. He basically needed to dig to see what exactly had been struck. And so with the shovel, he starts kind of moving away the mud and concrete, and at some point, the head of his shovel, the blade, it hit something sort of rigid and plastic. It was thick plastic sheeting like you would use in major construction projects. Curious why the sheeting would be underneath this outdoor shower, Aaron used a shovel and peeled away the plastic. As he did that, he began to notice that the sheeting was wrapped tightly around some sort of bulky object. And finally, he reveals the object, and it's this old coconut. Aaron was really confused by this. Like, why would somebody take the time to wrap a coconut in waterproof industrial sheeting and then bury it? And so as Aaron just sort of stood there wondering what this could be, he began rotating this coconut around in his hands. And when he saw the back of this coconut, he screamed. It would turn out Aaron's mother did not just suddenly abandon the family. On the night of January 6th, 1993, Aaron's mom and father got into this huge fight and got out of hand, and Aaron's father shot and killed Aaron's mother with a .22 caliber rifle. Aaron's father then staged the murder to look like Aaron's mother simply stormed out and never looked back. Now, when the police investigated her absence, they did not believe Aaron's father's story. They thought there was something off about it, but there wasn't enough hard evidence to actually connect him to the crime. And so nobody ever caught him. But that all changed in 2014 when a court ordered that the deed of Aaron's childhood home be transferred from his father to him. The coconut that Aaron found in the backyard of his home was his mother's skull. He just didn't realize it until he rotated it and saw her eye sockets. 5 years later, in 2019, Aaron's father was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in this shack with his father Rivelino, as well as his 2 younger brothers. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, his father, Rivelino, came into the room and he sat down next to him. And the two just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence. And as these two were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound sound coming from the kitchen. And he saw this dark figure on all fours quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified. He has no idea what this is. And so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. But eventually, Rivellino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. Whoever was out there, or whatever was out there, was talking about Rivellino. They could hear that name, and what they were kind of saying is, if Rivellino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And at that point, Rivellino told his sons to stay put, and he was going to go out there and investigate. He's got a knife in hand, just in case Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder, and this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story. Far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father. He opened up the door that led outside. He saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these like cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out this smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, like, "Dad, where are you going?" And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched this search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search. And then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaff sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaff. Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce. She would say to Stephen that this baby was not his. Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, "Okay, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you." Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house. He happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card. He knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open. She saw was her husband, and he walked in holding the bag. And when he opened it up, he reached inside and he pulled out Gregory's severed head. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. In the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers. But they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. The only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. And the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. She happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it. Generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away, and she couldn't believe how good it was. Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband, and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, like, this is so good. What's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, like, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No, this is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You gotta see it through." And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, "Not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance," which in today's money is $2.5 million. Her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story, The Tabby Saved from the Trash Can, would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. This is why you should always keep your head on a swivel. In 2017, an elderly woman who lived alone thought she saw something moving in her backyard and went to the window to have a look. As she's looking around, a shadowy figure emerges right on the other side of the glass, standing in her backyard. Terrified, she keeps an eye on the figure while calling police, but by the time she hangs up, the figure's gone. When the police arrive, her front door is unlocked, so they go inside and they find her still sitting in front of the window looking for this figure. The police search the backyard, but they don't find anything. When the police go back inside to search the house, they quickly find some large footprints that couldn't have been hers in the room that she was sitting in and all around the first floor. That's when they realized what was going on. She wasn't seeing a shadowy figure in her backyard. She was seeing the reflection of someone in the room with her. At 5:15 p.m. on June 28, 1980, a 38-year-old man named Robert Davidson drove his motorcycle down Interstate 74 in Acton, Indiana. On the back of the motorcycle, with her arms wrapped around his waist, was Robert's wife. But as Robert nudged his engine to go a little bit faster, these big raindrops began pelting his arms, and he knew the skies were opening up and he would have to pull over. But before he did that, there was this sudden flash of light, and then Robert felt pain all throughout his body, and then he crumpled off his bike onto the ground, and everything went black. Less than 5 minutes later, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and several first responders jumped out, including a woman named Kimberly Cobb. She felt for a pulse, but he didn't have one. And so Kimberly, she worked immediately on stabilizing Robert's spine, but something else began happening. There was this woman dressed in this old, long, black dress, screaming at them, and she's yelling at them to, "Hey, let me touch him! Let me touch him! I can save him!" And the first responders are looking at each other like, what is going on here? You need to picture this scene. They can't do anything to help Robert. And Robert basically is clinically dead at this point. And so when this woman came running up to the scene saying she could touch Robert and save him, they were sort of like, well, no one else is doing anything. And so the first responders and Wanda just allowed this woman to just wander up and crouch down next to Robert and begin this totally bizarre ritual. At first, the woman just began praying over Robert and began screaming up at the heavens, demanding they save this man's life. And then it was like something came over this woman. She grabbed her Bible and she lifted it over her head. She's kneeling right beside Robert. And when she opened her mouth and looked up at the sky, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was like another voice, and she began speaking in tongues, things that didn't make any sense. She's saying all these crazy gibberish things to the sky, and Robert began to breathe. But before anybody could make sense of that, the medical helicopter arrived, and seconds later it was chaos getting Robert onto the helicopter, and then before long, Robert, Wanda, and the helicopter took off, and then before long, Kimberly and the other first responders were just left there in the first moment of silence they had had for several minutes, just standing on the side of Interstate 74 thinking, what just happened? However, Kimberly and the other first responders would quickly learn that this particular stretch of highway, in fact, more specifically, the field off the side of this highway, where effectively the woman in black had disappeared to, used to be the home of a place called the Acton Campground, which was a Methodist community in the 1800s. The members of this community were known for their really loud prayer style and also for speaking in tongues. Now, unfortunately, this community actually burned to the ground in 1864. After the story of Robert's miraculous recovery began to spread, some people began to think that the woman in black might have been a ghost of one of these Acton residents from the 1800s who basically was drawn out to save Robert's life. By 1910, airplanes had improved to the point where they were considered a reasonable form of travel, and so people began focusing on how to make them safer. One big safety concern with airplanes at the time was there was no parachute small enough or light enough to be taken on board with passengers, and so if the plane malfunctioned and was crashing, everybody had to go down with it. So in 1911, a prominent French aviation club offered a large sum of money to anybody who could design a parachute for airplane passengers. A man named Franz Reichelt, who was a tailor in Paris, but who had always had a fascination with aviation, saw this reward in the paper and decided to take on this challenge. The design he came up with was not an external device like a backpack. Instead, it was a full suit with foldable bat wings that attached to the passenger's arms and connected all the way down to their ankles. Using his sewing know-how, he stitched up this totally bizarre looking prototype and he attached it to a dummy and threw it off of his apartment building. And amazingly, the dummy landed lightly on the ground. But when Franz, who significantly outweighed this dummy, put on his parachute suit and leapt off of the building himself, he did not touch the ground lightly. He smashed into the ground and broke his leg. But Franz was undeterred. He made dozens of changes to his suit, he added material, he subtracted material, and after a while, he felt like it was ready to be submitted to this French aviation club. But when the club members watched one of Franz's dummies wearing the suit come crashing into the ground because the canopy collapsed, they rejected his design. Franz was offended and decided he would prove them wrong. So in 1911, Franz began petitioning to the city of Paris to allow him to test his design off of the Eiffel Tower. He thought if he jumped from one of their platforms, that would be high enough for his canopy to fully inflate, thereby showing that his design really did work. In 1912, the city said, okay, you know what, Franz? You can test your parachute on the Eiffel Tower. But what the city didn't know, because Franz had intentionally kept it secret from them, was he didn't intend to launch a dummy off of the Eiffel Tower wearing his suit. He was going to put the parachute suit on and jump off these 17 stories himself. And so on February 4th of that year, Franz arrived at the tower, and standing around the base of it was a throng of people and journalists who had all read about this experiment in the newspaper. Then Franz promptly turned around and began walking up the stairs towards the platform. And with him was a journalist who brought a camera. Once Franz reached the platform, the journalist began filming him, and his video would capture Franz climbing up onto the railing and then hesitating. And he anxiously begins kind of rocking back and forth like he's debating whether he's really going to do this. And then at some point, he works up the courage and he jumps. And immediately his suit collapses and he slams into the ground, dying instantly. Another cameraman was on the ground and he filmed Franz's final jump. Here is a still shot of Franz right before impact. In the early 90s, a teenage girl started to see these shadowy figures that would come into a room at night and crawl all around her room and even grab at her legs. At the same time, her health began to rapidly deteriorate, which ultimately led to her death, which doctors never understood. A few days after her death, her sister woke up to a whistling sound and saw a creature crawling around her room with no face. The same night, her mom was ripped out of bed by someone. The father calls the police, who come over, they search the house, they don't find anything, it's all quiet. As they're about to leave, they hear something. Horrifying screams coming out of the bedroom. They run inside, no one's in there, but there are these huge gashes on the wall that were not there before. The police get out of there. In the police report that was filed immediately after this house call, the chief inspector and the 3 officers that were there that night swear they saw and heard the same things as the family, which means the police officially believed that the house was haunted. Ioana Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timișoara. Ioana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Ioana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Ioana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these 2 Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Loana, the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Loana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Loana, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. The medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Loana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those two Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the two primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Loana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Loana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing this image of Loana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Loana. And so now that you've seen this image, you're cursed too. Most people believe these three things will save your life. They don't. You're watching TV late at night and an urgent news bulletin comes on warning you there's been a zombie outbreak. You look out your window, sure enough, there's a zombie. What do? Your instincts are going to tell you to start sprinting around your house, turning on lights, smashing glassware, screeching like an owl, but you really shouldn't do that because you'll be alerting the zombie to your location, not repelling it. So instead, you decide to make a run for town. On your way, you see a group of people blazing down the road and you wonder if you should flag them down, try to get some help. But you shouldn't, because even though this outbreak is only 5 minutes old, everybody in the world who's not a zombie has already joined an evil biker gang and they just want to murder you. You take off running in order to avoid the biker gang and you reach a clearing in the woods where you run into your obviously infected best friend Karen, and you go up to give her a big hug because now you're saved. Except you're not, because Karen's a zombie and Karen just kills you. Yes, this really did happen. In 2015, a man woke up to a strange post-it note sitting on his desk. On it was a to-do list that he didn't recognize in handwriting that didn't look like his. Since he was up late the night before doing some work, he assumed he must have written out the list when he was half asleep and kind of forgot about it, so he just crumples it up and throws it away. 2 weeks later, he wakes up to dozens of these post-it notes all over his wall, and they're all blank except for one that in the same weird handwriting says, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you." Now feeling totally freaked out that some crazy person is crawling around his apartment at night, he starts looking for signs of a break-in, but there aren't any. Instead of calling the police, he shares his experience on Reddit asking for help, and one user's comment literally saves his life. Turns out the man was writing the notes to himself and then forgetting, because his brain was slowly dying due to a carbon monoxide leak that was only discovered because a user suggested he install a detector. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn. Her dad had just got her this beautiful, brand new yellow Camaro. A police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the lieutenant jumped jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl. And he asks her, "Are you okay?" And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. He thought maybe she's drunk. The lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk, but she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency, but they didn't know what it was. Roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery. On the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents. They said that Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies. Adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots. Detective Seidman, thinking logically, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere, but they found nothing. Detective Seidman decided to go find witnesses. He gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. When the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working. He said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat. And at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, Theodore was in fact out in his boat, except he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. But he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits.
December of 2000, there was this guy named Gordon Moffat, and he was working on Magellan, this offshore oil rig off the coast of Scotland, and he was a mechanic, and so he didn't actually work on drilling the oil. His job was to basically maintain the drill. And so at any moment, he could be called to do some sort of maintenance. And so he suddenly gets a call saying, hey, there's a new issue with the drill. This is the middle of the night, it's stormy outside. I mean, it's like the perfect setting for a horrible disaster. So the only way to access this portion of the drill is to be put in a harness and basically lowered, like in between platforms. The drill kind of wobbles around, you can get crushed between it. And so on every single platform, there's like 10 or 15 of them, they would cut these 10-inch by 10-inch holes that were sort of like 2-3 feet away from the central cutout. And they would lower their harnesses through those so that basically people like Gordon could access these inaccessible places
without being in the situation where you get smashed.
So you're safe that way.
Yeah.
And so he goes down one level to the platform right below. You know, you can see his colleagues 20 feet above him on the platform right above. And he's like, all right, send down the harness. So the winch operator hits start and the winch slowly begins to retract, and slowly but surely Gordon is lifted off the ground on the lower platform, and he's brought up, 10 feet until he could access the section of the drill that he couldn't before. So the guys above him wave to the hoist operator, like, all right, stop it. He hits the button, it stops. And so Gordon fixes the drill, it begins to work again, everything's great. And so he signals to the guys above him, like, hey, I'm ready to go back down again. And so the winch operator's like, okay. He hits the start button, and then just kind of starts looking off into space. Like, this is his only job, is literally pushing this button.
Yeah.
That's all he does. And so he's not really paying attention. He didn't realize that he had not reversed the settings of the winch, that instead of flipping it to now when he hits start, it lowers Gordon. He had left it in retract mode. And so when he hit start, the winch began to continue to raise Gordon up towards the platform above him where that mouse hole is. And so the guys on the upper platform, they notice this, they turn and they're like, come on, dude, you screwed it up. But the guy doesn't hear them. So they have this phone that's right nearby that radios up to the hoist operator. And so the hoist operator answers it, and he's like, stop the winch, it's going the wrong way. And so the hoist operator hits stop, but nothing happens. So what had happened in the space of time between them realizing this wasn't stopping and going to the phone is Gordon had been pulled all the way up to right below the platform. And the only way he was going to go is through the mouse hole, which is a 10-inch by 10-inch hole. And the harness had no quick release on it. And so this 3-point harness that he can't get out of raised him up until his pelvis was pressed to to the underside of this hole, and then slowly, as they finally got the guy on the phone, they pulled his pelvis through the hole. And so by the time the guy hit stop, the guy's spine, pelvis, and most of his torso had been ripped through, and unfortunately
He made it?
And he made it.
Wow.
This is why you should always sprint up your stairs at night. In 2018, a boy was up late gaming in his basement when he decided to go to bed. The basement's only light was controlled by a pull chain at the foot of the stairs, which meant after he pulled it, he'd be downstairs in darkness, so he would sprint up the stairs. Because everybody knows if you're not fast enough, this guy'll get you. So he did just that, and he made it upstairs safely when he realized he had forgotten his phone in the basement. So he took a deep breath and headed right back down.
Why do you think people have such morbid curiosities for some of the stories?
It's funny. I think that as humans, there is a desire to be frightened in a safe, controlled environment. And what's more terrifying than seeing real people had something kind of random and abrupt that happened to anyone happen to them? Someone breaks into their house, or they go to some off-limits part of a park and fall off a cliff or something. That could happen to me, but I'm safe. My guide, in this case me, is like telling me, like buddy to buddy, telling you a story about this horrible thing, and you get like the thrill of fear and anxiety, but it's not real. It's the same reason we flock to like scary movies in movie theaters, because you want to be scared, but only because it's actually not real. But your brain processes fear the same way. So you get real fear, real kind of shot of adrenaline, but the comfort of real safety. But I do think it's kind of like a human trait. I think that humans have a morbid curiosity, and I don't think that's wrong. I think it's part of being human.
That kind of fucked with me a bit.
I love it.
On December 16th, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had had a couple of drinks. As Nestor is driving, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road, and so at full speed, he smashes into this deer. He looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, but when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. Nestor pulled up and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. He had to call a tow truck, but his phone was dead. So Nestor walks into the restaurant and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? You know, hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, you know, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. He eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. It was a police officer who said, "Get out of the car." So Nestor, he gets out of the car, and Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer and how sorry he was. But the officer took his flashlight and immediately grabbed his radio, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car. And when he looked, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. The reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated.
Oh yeah, Gloria Ramirez.
Yes.
She was like terminal cancer, and she was doing DIY treatments, which included rubbing this mechanical wax or something you can pick up at the hardware store, like all over her body. Then her organs started to shut down. She got brought into the emergency room, and she began emitting this garlicky odor, and like the nurses and doctors began passing out in the room with her. They tried to take her blood, but when they pulled the blood out, it like crystallized inside of the tube. Basically, it turned into this like biohazard. It was this perfect series of events. It started with this wax she put on. Her skin absorbed it, it, and then it mixed with the type of treatment she was getting for her cancer, I believe, and it created this like new chemical that is harmless unless it's like oxidized or something. So like the oxygen mixed with this new chemical and created a toxic chemical, but don't worry, it's only toxic if it gets pulled out of her body. And suddenly you've exposed this chemical to the open air and it became lethal. All the things that happened in a row had to happen exactly as they happened. Like the odds of this happening are basically zero.
In the early 1900s, a 10-year-old boy was playing in the woods when a tall man appeared and asked if he wanted to come back to his cabin for dinner. Totally caught off guard, the boy reluctantly agrees and begins walking. When they get to the cabin, the boy is relieved when he sees Paul, a family friend, sitting on the porch, so the boy happily goes inside. After they eat, the boy says thank you to the strange tall man, says bye to Paul, and then he leaves. He had only walked a few steps when he sees his family, along with Paul, running up the path towards him, frantically asking if he was okay. Confused, the boy says, I'm just fine, and he looks at Paul and he's like, why didn't you tell them I was with you at the cabin? And he points over his shoulder. Paul glances over the boy's shoulder and then narrows his eyes and says, you were kidnapped by a cult 3 days ago. No one's seen you. Terrified, the boy turns around to look at the cabin he just came from, and it's gone. All he sees is a dark forest that stretches for miles.
The one that kind of messed me up, it was like a mall, and the guy goes through this one door and gets sent into this corridor where it's just like a catacomb of just all of these different, it's just like cement walls, cement floor, cement ceiling.
There's a mall in Australia that is famous. It's this huge mall, like bordering it, but unseen to the public are all these passageways for staff and storekeepers to move around away from like the main walking areas. You can like access your store and whatever from but there's 8 miles of it. And it's really not patrolled, I suppose. There's not cameras there, and this guy was senile and he wandered into this area, and there were enough doors that were locked around him that he just sat down thinking, okay, someone's gonna find me, but they didn't. And it was just like, again, just like so sad,
waiting,
you know? And then when he was found, he's like just hunched over on his chair, just sitting there for like a month. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neary Morgan was walking with his 2 younger brothers through a desert in South Australia called Maralinga. Neary and his brothers were members of an isolated Aboriginal tribe called the Martu, and they were out right now to hunt kangaroos for their family. So Neary had a spear, and his 2 younger brothers had a club, and they also had a boomerang. And for a while, they had been tracking this particular group of kangaroos. Eventually, this group of kangaroos stopped at a watering hole, which was just a few dozen yards away from them. And so at that point, the brothers knew this was their chance. And so they got down in the brush and began advancing on the kangaroos. But after only taking a few steps, they heard this loud rumbling sound off in the distance. And as they looked to see what was going on, the sky suddenly was illuminated impossibly bright. This extremely hot gust of wind came blasting through and literally knocked the brothers onto the ground, totally disorienting them. And then from the ground, at some point, Neary kind of turns his head and he happens to look in the direction where the kangaroos were. Then he sees them literally floating in the air, coming right over to him and then dropping on the ground. And then a moment later, it was like everything just went back to normal. And they're thinking, what's just happened here was a gift from God. Neary and his brothers began lifting up these kangaroos and carrying as many as they could back to their tribe. And then that night, the tribe had this big celebration, and they had this big feast, and they ate all this kangaroo meat. But then the next day, when the tribe woke up, everybody who had eaten any of that kangaroo was violently sick. And over the next few days, some people did recover, but a lot of others did not. And soon, people from this tribe began dying. This whole event remained a mystery until 1967. It would turn out all those dead kangaroos that got kind of dumped out of the sky right in front of Neary and his brothers were not the result of God giving them a gift. Instead, the reason that happened was because of a big scientific experiment that was conducted in Maralinga in total secrecy. The British government was testing nuclear bombs. Neary and his brothers had been a few kilometers away from a detonation site. Where they were positioned was basically exactly in the right spot to where they would feel the effects of the explosion, but they were just far enough away from the detonation site that the shockwave and the blast and all that did not kill them.
However, those kangaroos they had been stalking were technically closer to the detonation site, that when that shockwave passed through, it lifted up and obliterated the kangaroos and threw them right in front of Neary. The Australian government ultimately paid $13.5 million in compensation to Aboriginal tribes that were affected by these tests. As for Neary, he survived, and today he's actually in his 80s, and he continues to tell his story to younger generations. Friday, September 18th, 2015, a 45-year-old man named Lattori Barman stumbled down a pitch-black street in a small village in central India. Lattori was stumbling because he was very, very drunk. He and his wife had spent most of the night together out at this local fair, and then at some point his wife had actually broken off and gone to her parents' house in another village, and then now he had finally decided he had had enough, he was extremely intoxicated, and he just wanted to get back home. And so as Lattori stumbled down this road, he could really only see maybe a foot in front of him, not only because he was so drunk, but also because the streets in his village did not have lights, and so it was totally dark. However, this wasn't unusual for Lattori. I mean, this is where he lived, but what did strike him as odd, he thought it was weird that there was a lot of people out on the road. He couldn't really see them, but he could definitely hear them. Like there was people sort of all over the place, and he also sort of in his intoxicated state saw some lights that maybe were vehicles sort of moving around. So there was more activity on this road than usual, but at the same time, like this is a main road and sometimes there's lots of people and cars on it, even late at night. So this didn't really strike him as odd enough to stop and investigate. He just kept on walking towards his house. But as he's walking through with all this commotion all around him, at some point he goes to step, but instead of his foot striking the ground again, there's nothing there. And suddenly he feels himself falling and he smashes into the ground, and now truly it's pitch black. He can't see anything and he blacks out. The following morning, a group of villagers were walking down the same street that Lattori had been on the night before, and as they were walking, now in broad daylight, they looked up ahead and they noticed something odd right in the middle of the street. And at first they had no idea what it was, and so they walked closer to it to get a better look, and as they walked up on this thing, they instantly understood what it was. It would turn out the reason Lattori was hearing and seeing all these people and vehicles on the street the night before was because there was actually a construction crew repairing potholes in that road. And Lattori, as he was stumbling along, accidentally fell into one of these deep potholes, smashed the ground, and was knocked unconscious. And because this worksite was so chaotic, none of the crew saw Lattori fall in, and Lattori was too drunk to get out of the hole. And so at some point that night, the construction crew reached the pothole that Lattori was in. They didn't see him, and they poured molten tar into the hole and then rolled over it with a roller, all with Lattori inside the hole. And so after they were done and moved on to the next pothole, Lattori in his final moments tried to pull himself out of this tar, but he only managed to get his hand up and out of the tar. And so the next day, the group of villagers that walked down the road, they saw Lattori's hand poking out of the ground. Lattori's body was removed from the street and he was given a proper burial. There were 2 construction workers who were ultimately arrested and charged with culpable homicide. As for Lattori's family, authorities would give them a compensation payment for Lattori's death, but it was only worth approximately $760. At 6 p.m. on October 27th, 2014, a 17-year-old boy named Jesus Meneses was playing basketball with a group of friends on an outdoor basketball court. At some point, when Jesus and his team had possession, one of his teammates just got frazzled by the defense and just took this crazy three-point shot from way behind the line, and the ball just sailed right past the hoop, completely missed it, air ball, and it bounced and then went clean over this chain link fence on the edge of the park. Basically, anything that went over that fence was pretty much gone forever. But to Jesus' surprise, one of his friends turned to Jesus and was like, "Hey, why don't you just hop the fence and go get the ball?" Now, Jesus really did not want to do that. I mean, he had been coming to this park since he was like 1 year old with his family, and his mom and dad had always told him to never, ever climb that fence. But now, Jesus' friend who had asked him to do this had kind of like turned it into a dare, and he's like, "No, really, come on, Jesus, go hop the fence and get the ball." And so he's thinking to himself, "Hey, what's the worst that could happen?" And he's like, "All right, I'll go get it." And so Jesus left the basketball court and walked over to this fence. And it was about 7 feet tall, and there was all this barbed wire across the top of it. And he begins climbing the fence. And he gets to the top and he reaches the barbed wire and he very carefully positions himself so he doesn't cut himself on the way over. And right after he's cleared the barbed wire, he kind of tumbles to the other side of the fence. He hits the ground, except when he hits the ground after clearing that fence, something horrible happens. Within seconds of Jesus landing inside of that fenced-in area, his friends back on the court saw what was going on and began totally panicking. Eventually, one of them would call 911, and then minutes later, first responders show up, and the first responders, they look, and they know right away there's virtually nothing they can do to save Jesus. The reason these fences were totally off limits, the reason Jesus' family specifically warned him from when he was a young kid to never ever climb them, was because inside was an electrical power grid. And there were signs all over that it was dangerous, no trespassing, fatalities will occur if you go in here. But Jesus ignored the warnings and he climbed the first fence. Except when he landed on a live electrical wire. And the second he did, 500,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. For reference, the average lightning bolt contains about 300,000 volts of electricity. So, as soon as Jesus hit that wire, it was like the equivalent of 2 lightning bolts striking him at once, but not just one time, over and over and over again. And so unfortunately, Jesus died almost immediately. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And his condition was still so bad that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, the instant he saw the teacher for the day, he was really excited because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. Now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so that day, Rich played the drum and he and everybody else were objectively terrible. But by the end of the class, Rich had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. But on Christmas of 1956, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit and he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off, and before long he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right as Rich is kind of hitting his stride being this kind of local celebrity, this local very popular band fired their drummer, and so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, "Hey, will you join our band?" And Rich said, "Let's do it." By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles.